is October 23rd, 2023. And today we'll be talking about the standards that are listed there in yellow, talking about the impact of historical events in United States history, using maps and documents and artifacts, a couple of video clips. We'll evaluate and interpret sources for perspective and historical context. So as we're going through the American Revolution, the whole time we're going through it, you should be thinking about what things are going on in the minds of the British who are doing these things to the Americans, and how upset do the Americans have to be to actually feel like fighting back and doing something about it. So we'll start out today with a real quick video clip that kind of goes all the way back and reviews where these issues with the British started, and it'll take us up into the beginning of the American Revolution. So what gets us going? And then we'll get started with the fill-in notes for Chapter 7, the beginning of the Revolution, through a couple of slides, and we'll talk a little bit more about people like George Washington, about the division of loyalties between the king and the Sons of Liberty and the people who were neutral, things that we talked about in class the other day with maybe a little bit more detail. And I'd like you to start working on your Chapter 7 study guide, moving vocab and anything over that can be moved over so that we can have success. If anybody in here is in line to retake the Chapter 5-6 test, remember I need you to study. Make sure your study guide is accurate and complete. Make sure that you have an email from at least one parent to me, or a paper note will be fine also, that says that you've been studying and that you're ready for a retake. And all those retakes must be done before the end of the day on Thursday. And a quick reminder to you, I am gone Monday, obviously. This is why you're watching this video, and I will also be gone Wednesday. You'll probably have something similar to this. So Tuesday is an option for you, and Thursday is an option for you. And if necessary, I can also set up a time for you to stay with another teacher. So make sure you get your end of the job taken care of, and I'll take care of mine as best I can. Communicate through email if you have any questions or comments, or you need anything from me. So today we're going to start out with this video. It's called The American Revolution Oversimplified, and it really goes back earlier than the American Revolution. You know, here we got the king and the queen, and Christopher Columbus is going to be coming in. And there are a couple of parts of this video clip that are advertisements. That's how videos make a lot of their money off of YouTube. I'll try my best to fast forward through those, but if you watch with me, I might even pause and make a comment here and there. So watch and stay with me. I'll try to keep today's video to under 40 minutes and then give you some time to work on that study guide. I don't want it to get too long and too out of hand for us. So please follow along and pay attention.
Holy smokes! Christopher Columbus, that is no way to address the King and Queen of Spain. What is wrong with you? Okay, so you know how we're looking for a new trade route to India, right? Right. And the Earth is round, right? Right. So I'm thinking we can just sail the other way around the planet, right? Yeah. So I set sail, right? Mm-hmm. And I reach India, right? Right. Wrong. I did not reach India. I did not. All right, get to the point. Did you know there's a whole nother freaking continent out there? Okay, and you think I should care about this? Why? Oh, I'm sorry. Did I forget to mention there's gold everywhere? Gold? Columbus landed in Central America in October 1492, and he had the time of his life. And by that I mean he went on a huge theft and murder spree. He stole gold, jewelry, people, and a hammock. And then he returned to show off all of his riches, including a few previously undiscovered items, such as tobacco, the pineapple, turkeys, and a hammock. Now I know what you're thinking, but oversimplified, Columbus didn't discover America, the Vikings did. And you'd be partially right. In the 11th century,
Remember, as you're watching this video, this is called oversimplified, so it's not necessarily 100% accurate, but it should paint a good picture for you.
Erickson was the first European to land in America. But hey, if you love Vikings so much, then why don't you check out today's sponsor? Vikings War of Clans is a mobile game that was inspired by the alliances in the description. Me up and join my Vikings miss time of his life, hammock. And suddenly the race was on to explore and conquer the New World. After a couple centuries of warring with the natives and each other, the European powers had claimed quite a lot of land, including this area, which both the English and the French claimed as theirs. One day the French said, "I'm gonna build some forts along here," and the English were like, "Could you not?" And the French said, "Sorry, but no, I could not." And they went ahead and built their forts, which pissed off the English, so they sent an up-and-coming British lieutenant colonel by the name
ticked off the English.
of George Washington with a combined force of British troops and Native Americans. After a short battle, the French commander said, all right, we surrender. Okay, boys, pack it up. There's surrender. Oh, sorry, was I not meant to split his head open with a tomahawk? Don't worry, it's not like this will start a 7-year-long major global conflict. And what happened next was a 7-year-long major global conflict, which Great Britain won. At the peace negotiations, Spain gave up Florida, while France gave up all of its territories in North America. But Britain's victory came at a cost, a £60 million cost. They were now broke, in a lot of debt, and had to come up with some
Remember, pounds were the money of the time, not dollars.
way to repay it. So they went to the colonies and said, okay, listen up. So a huge part of the war was spent protecting you from the French, and now we have no money because of it. So I'm not sure what you're saying here. Okay, so we spent a lot of money protecting you from the French, right? Right. And now we're broke. That certainly is a pickle. Listen to me. We spent all of our money protecting you, and now we need money. Can you please pay us back some money? No. Okay, we're just going to go ahead and tax you. In 1764, Britain introduced the Sugar Act, forcing the colonists to import sugar and molasses exclusively from the British and to pay duties on them. Then a year later, they introduced the extremely controversial Stamp Act, and it worked a little something like this. Hello, shopkeep. Hello, Mr. Bungleberry. Here's the deed for your new shack. Stamp. That'll be 3 pence, please. Wait, what was that? It's the new tax. I get a stamp on any paper or documentation I make, and you have to pay for it. Would you like to see this pamphlet that explains everything? Yes, please. Okay. Stamp. 2 pence, please. This is awful. You know what? Just give me a deck of cards so I can go gamble my pain away. Okay. No. Don't do it. Stamp. Obviously, the colonists were like, hey, my dudes, this new tax legislation right here, this is BS. Until now, they had enjoyed relative freedom to rule themselves, and now suddenly Britain was asserting its control. They were especially unhappy because they didn't have any representatives in the parliament that was levying taxes on them. So they protested. Orators gave fiery speeches. British goods were boycotted, and anyone loyal to the British found themselves increasingly harassed. The whole thing actually began to take quite a toll on British business, and after just a couple years, the British were forced to repeal the Stamp Act. But we still desperately need money. What should we do? We could try taxing the colonies. Great idea. Wait, didn't we literally just try that and it failed miserably? Man, look at me. I look fabulous. Have you ever seen such a handsome boy? No siree, Georgie. No way. You're the handsomest, smartest, most popular king that ever lived, and everybody likes you. You're doing such a good job. Your Majesty? Oh, you're still here. Get the hell out. So in 1766, the British
Get the heck out.
made a declaration saying, we can do what we want because we're in charge and you can all go suck it. Then they levied a whole bunch of new taxes on the Americans via import duties. Glass? There's a tax for that. Lead? There's a tax for that. Paper? Tea? Oil? There's a tax for that. And once again, the Americans boycotted British goods, British business felt the pinch, and the British had to back down. Alright, this is ridiculous. They're my colonies, and I have to be able to assert my control. Repeal all the new taxes except for the one on tea. Also send 1,000 troops to Boston to take control. Oh, and make the colonists pay for them. And as British troops arrived, the tension in Boston was palpable. You could cut it with a knife, and it was all about to come to a head. On March 5th, a band of local patriots began heckling a British guard at the customs house. More and more Americans joined in the heckling, while more British troops turned up in support of their comrade. Snowballs were thrown at the British. The snowballs turned to rocks, the rocks to oyster shells. The soldiers, outnumbered, panicked. One thing leads to another, and you can see where this is going. 5 civilians were killed. The Patriot press throughout the colonies declared the Boston Massacre an unwarranted crime committed against the people of Boston by the cruel British, and the anger continued to grow. A British revenue schooner that ran aground in Rhode Island was burned by the locals. When it came to light that the governor of Massachusetts supported the suppression of the colonists, his house was burned by the locals. And next, the colonists would set their sights on the remaining tax on tea. On December 16, 1773, a band of patriots known as the Sons of Liberty, disguised themselves as Native Americans, marched down to Boston Harbor, boarded a British merchant ship loaded with tea, and in front of thousands of spectators, threw nearly 10,000 pounds worth of tea overboard. The British were disgusted, and they punished Massachusetts with a vengeance. They dissolved its General Assembly, revoked their charter, and sent 3,000 more troops to occupy the city, meaning Boston and Massachusetts were now essentially under the direct rule of Great Britain. And oh boy, were the people pissed. The other colonies saw what was happening and worried they might be next. So they called a brain trust to decide what to do. 56 delegates from 12 colonies gathered and met in Philadelphia at the First Continental Congress. And the roll call read like a who's who of America's finest thinkers. I'm talking lawyers extraordinaire Johnny A. and Johnny J., experienced military commander George Washington, businessman and future alcoholic beverage Samuel Adams, fiery orator Patty H., guy who married a rich lady, Big J. Dickinson. And while they weren't present at the First Congress, soon names like James Madison, Benjamin Franklin, Thomas Jefferson, and much later Alexander Hamilton would all serve time in the Continental Congress. The question now, though, was what to do about the British. After much bitter debate and disagreement, they eventually agreed on an amazing solution. They would simply ask the British to stop. Can you stop? No. It didn't work. Okay, then tell the local militias to start arming and be ready at a minute's notice. And across the colonies, these Minutemen stood ready for the beginning of the American Revolutionary War. Now, having your colonies in open rebellion is one thing. Once they start arming themselves, that's when it really hits the fan. So British General Thomas Gage ordered 700 troops from Boston out into the rebel-controlled Massachusetts countryside to destroy stores of arms and ammunition held by the rebels in Concord. The British set out in the middle of the night. Patriots including Paul Revere rode ahead to warn that the British were coming, giving the rebels time to prepare. The two sides met in Lexington as the sun began to rise. They faced off against each other, and in the confusion, somebody shot first. The shot heard around the world marked the beginning of the American War of Independence. The rebels were outnumbered and had to fall back to Concord as the British split up to search for rebel supplies. However, more and more Patriot rebels kept showing up, and this time it was the British who were outnumbered as more fighting kicked off in Concord. The most professional army in the world was forced to flee back to Boston at the hands of local, poorly trained militiamen. And all along the British route back to Boston, Patriot rebels continued to gather and open fire on the retreating British. When the British reached Boston, the rebel militias surrounded them. Boston and the British were now under siege as small land and naval skirmishes continued around the city. And the British would suffer another embarrassing blow, this time in upstate New York. Colonel Benedict Arnold concocted a plan to take the British stronghold Fort Ticonderoga, which held a large amount of guns and ammunition. He set off towards the fort alone, hoping to recruit men along the way, when he came across the Green Mountain Boys, led by Ethan Allen, who, as it turned out, had the exact same plan he did. So they decided to work together. But I'm in charge. No, 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 I'm in charge. This went on for some time, until the Green Mountain Boys threatened to go home, and Arnold had to concede. The group raided the fort at night while the Redcoats were asleep, and they caught them completely by surprise, taking the fort and all of its munitions with almost no resistance. Wow, great job, Ethan. Very impressive. By the way, what happened to that other guy we sent to take the fort? Who? Benedict Arnold. Never heard of him. Ouch. What the fuck? Nobody knew what was going on. The colonies were in open rebellion, and for now, they even seemed to be winning. So King George fired General Gage, replaced him with General William Howe, and ordered the rebellion to be put down immediately. Okay, the British are definitely going to retaliate for all of this, so we should probably put together a proper army. First, we need to pick a commander-in-chief, and I think we can all agree that that job should go to the man, the myth, the legend, George Washington. My friends, I am humbled and honored that you would consider me for such an important role. I did not expect for this. All right, you've been showing up in a military uniform every day for the last 10 months. We all know you wanted this, so cut the crap, George. Dude. Uncool. So Washington began his journey up to Boston to take command of the newly established Continental Army, just as the British made their first major attempt to break the siege. They made plans to take the high ground on Bunker Hill, but spies warned the Continentals of the British plans, so they fortified Bunker Hill and set up defensive positions on nearby Breed's Hill. The day of the battle came, and as the British advanced, a barrage of Continental gunfire was opened up on them. Twice they tried to climb the hill, twice they were pushed back. The battle lasted 3 hours until the Continentals finally ran out of ammunition and had to retreat, allowing the British to take the hill. While technically a British victory, they suffered nearly 1,000 casualties to the Continentals' 400. The colonists showed the British that this wasn't just a rebellion, it was war, and they were ready for it. But one thing they weren't sure about was why they were fighting. While some radicals were starting to throw around the I word, most hoped to eventually repair their relationship with Great Britain. So they sent a letter to King George saying, "Hey man, looks like things aren't going your way. Remove the taxes and let's be friends? I'm gonna kick your ass." Send that to the colonies. Your Majesty, your handwriting is terrible. Are you sure? Just do it. What does it say? He's gonna lick my... Gross. So for the remainder of the year, small engagements continued to occur around the colonies. The British burned down the towns of Falmouth, Massachusetts and Norfolk, Virginia as revenge for earlier anti-British incidents. These actions played right into the hands of Patriot propaganda. Overseas, the British were seen as brutes, and the French and Spanish would soon begin sending supplies to the rebel cause. During this time, there was also minor fighting going on between Patriot and Loyalist militias in the southern colonies. Benedict Arnold was still on a mission to win some personal glory for himself, so he headed up an attempt to invade Canada in a two-pronged attack. The Continentals managed to capture some British forts and the city of Montreal, but a harsh snowstorm with some smallpox on the side saw them defeated and pushed back at Quebec City, and they were forced to retreat all the way to Fort Ticonderoga. Speaking of which, remember all those guns and ammunition? Well, this guy's got a plan for what to do with them. He uses oxen to drag 120,000 pounds of artillery for 2 months through the harsh winter, 300 miles all the way to Washington and his Continental Army surrounding Boston. Boom. Washington's got himself some big guns, which is fortunate because up until now his army had been suffering through the cold winter, not knowing when the siege would end. Now they could make a move. Washington wanted to launch a full assault on the city, but his junior officers felt the British were too fortified, and to his credit, Washington was great at hearing and taking on board the ideas of others. Instead, the Continentals worked through the night, setting the guns up on Dorchester Heights, overlooking the city, and when dawn broke and the British saw the guns, they knew they were toast. Their positions were completely exposed. It was checkmate. They had no choice but to abandon the city. 120 ships carried 9,000 redcoats and 2,000 loyalists away to an unknown fate, and Washington had his first victory of the war. Washington then moved his army to New York, knowing that when the British returned, they would probably land there. In the meantime, a friendly-looking old man by the name of Thomas Paine had written and published a pamphlet called Common Sense, in which he advocated for total independence from Great Britain. It spread across the colonies like wildfire, and to this day remains the best-selling title in America. It was read aloud in taverns and meeting halls, and brought the idea of independence into the mainstream. Congress began to seriously consider the idea. Thomas Jefferson was selected to write up an official Declaration of Independence, and he went hard, writing that all men are created equal, with certain inalienable rights, including life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. Of course, Jefferson had over 100 slaves, but we don't have to talk about that. On the 2nd of July, Congress voted unanimously in favor of independence, and John Adams declared that the 2nd of July would go down as the most remembered day in American history. Then a couple days later, independence actually came into effect. The United States of America was born. There was no turning back now. The Americans tore down a statue of King George in New York and melted him down into 42,000 musket balls. To the British, it was treason, and if the king had his way, Washington and all of Congress would be hung. Speaking of the British, guess who's back? The king sent an intimidating force of 130 warships and 25,000 men to New York. Washington knew that taking on the most powerful military in the world wouldn't be easy. The British set up camp on Staten Island as the Americans dug into defensive positions around Brooklyn Heights, waiting for an attack to come. But the British just waited, wearing down their opponent's nerve while building their own strength. At one point, they launched a big scary artillery barrage and then said, you know, if I was you right now, I'd probably sue for peace. But Washington told them to shove it. The Americans kept holding out for what was coming, and when they finally hit, they hit hard. 15,000 British troops approached the American position, and the two sides fired on each other in massive rows. But what the Americans didn't realize was they were only fighting a decoy. The main British force was going around to flank the Americans from behind, and when they arrived, they inflicted heavy casualties. The Americans panicked and retreated back to Brooklyn Heights, where they then found themselves trapped between the British army and the river. It looked as though the war was already lost, but luckily, instead of attacking, the British decided to dig in for a siege, and then a thick fog set in, allowing Washington's army to escape across the river unimpeded. The British continued to chase and engage the Americans up Manhattan, and the Americans suffered defeat after defeat after defeat. It was a disaster. Washington's leadership was called into question, as thousands of American POWs were left to rot as traitors. Washington's army fled through New Jersey all the way down to Pennsylvania. Rarely had an army been so badly beaten, yet survived to fight another day.
Okay, so that gets us started with the American Revolution. So we'll move into what is our Chapter 7 notes. So if you don't have your Chapter 7 fill-in notes pulled up, now would be an outstanding time to do that. As we get started, and we won't go too far today into this, but we're looking at the years from 1775 to 1783. We've already touched on 1776 with the Declaration of Independence, and by the way, in that video they talked about how Thomas Jefferson owned over 100 slaves. Jefferson, throughout most of his life, went kind of back and forth over the idea of ownership of slaves. He also had some personal issues that nobody ever likes to talk about. Like, for instance, Jefferson really badly wanted to have children, and he was very in love with his wife, but many men of the time, I won't necessarily say most, but weren't necessarily loyal to their wives, even if they were in love with them. But Mrs. Jefferson couldn't give birth. I believe she had one or two children, and maybe one or two that were stillborn, which means they were born dead, because she was very, very diabetic, and it's difficult for a person that can't control their diabetes, which wasn't well understood at the time, to have babies. So we do know Jefferson did have a child with at least one of his slaves, maybe multiples. And throughout his life, he struggled with the idea of slavery, even though they were necessary for the running of his plantation in Monticello. But his problem was, even when he decided he didn't want to have slaves anymore, because Jefferson was in debt, he was never a super wealthy man, the law in Virginia said that he could not free his slaves. You couldn't give away property if you were in debt. So The only thing that Jefferson could possibly do with his slaves was sell them to make money to pay off his debt, and he wasn't comfortable in doing that. So, yeah, we look at these men in history like George Washington and Thomas Jefferson as slave owners, and we can see that those are some imperfections definitely in their character by our standards today, something that would have been considered maybe potentially normal at the time, uh, different back then. So when we start out, talking about George Washington coming to the rescue, looks like I've got an error message on this video that I want to play for you. But it's kind of a funny video, so let me back up and see if I can find it for you. It's worth a quick watch. This is from a Dodge commercial, but I think it's funny, so we'll watch it anyway.
Here's a couple of things America got right: cars and freedom.
Absolutely nothing to do with history, but it's kind of funny. And no, Riker, there were no cars in George Washington's army. That was just pretend, just for fun. But anyway, G-Dub does come to the rescue, and we've talked about that a little bit. Here's the thing. When we look at Americans and their division, and we talked about this in class also last week, but if we use that continuum at the front of the classroom representing the entire population, 20 to 30% of America were loyalists. And most of them were in New York and in the South. They were less upset by the taxes and the mistreatment that the British were imparting on them. So if 20% are loyalists, if we're just looking at the classroom, if there are 20 people in the classroom and we're talking about 20%, that'd be 4 of you would be loyal to the king still, regardless of the taxes and the ill punishment and the lack of personal freedoms and liberties. If we're talking about 30%, that's 5 of you, at least 5 of you, that would be loyal to the king. When we talk about the Patriots, and they're the strongest in New England, that area around Boston and Massachusetts, 40 to 45%, not quite half of the country were patriots, were members of the Sons and Daughters of Liberty. The rest were neutral. So, we've got 30% of the country that don't pick a side. It's kind of like when we talk about politics today, a third of the country see themselves as strong Republicans, and maybe a third of the country see themselves as strong Democrats, and then the rest of the country kind of fits in the middle, and there aren't a whole lot of people that represent those in the middle. But we also try to use propaganda. That's information designed to help a cause to get people to join our side. So there was pressure on the neutrals all the time by the loyalists and by the patriots to try to get them to join up. And we even look at the video that I just showed you, the Dodge commercial with George Washington. That's an example of propaganda. If you watch the commercial and you're impressed by it, maybe you want to buy a Dodge Challenger. But not everyone is influenced by all versions of propaganda. Some are better than others. Or the picture, the Uncle Sam poster that we talked about during World War II a week or so ago in class. Those are great examples, but we can't win a war if less than half the country wants to win a war versus the British. So we've got to have people like Thomas Paine writing the pamphlet Common Sense, convincing people that it's their duty to fight back against the tyranny of the king. That's necessary. We do also have a certain group of people in America that are pacifists who just refuse to fight in wars, like the Quakers. William Penn in Pennsylvania, many of the people that live in Pennsylvania are pacifists. They won't fight. In some instances, the British even offered freedom to slaves if they fought alongside the British in this war. So we've got all kinds of issues politically and militarily that we've got to deal with. if we have any chance at all of winning independence. Declaring independence is one thing, winning independence is something completely separate and above the Declaration. You know, you can tell your parents all you want, I'm going out Friday night, but until they give you permission, you're not going anywhere. So the British do everything they can to make independence and winning independence more and more difficult for the Americans, even without using soldiers as weapons. It'll come to that, but it's not necessarily in all instances. If you take the slaves away from southern plantation owners, it makes the British stronger, makes the Americans weaker, but also up here, if it says the South has the most loyalists, and the South is the region of the country that has the highest number of slaves, and you take slaves away from them, what do you think these Southerners that are loyalists might do? Pause for you to think for a moment. Yes, some of them are going to get upset by the fact that their slaves have been taken away by the British, and some of them are going to join up with the Patriots. So we're constantly, throughout the beginning years of the war, seeing these numbers shifting from 20 to 30%, from 45 to 55 to 60%. We're seeing the numbers change as the tide of the war turns. Maybe even when it starts to look late in the war, like the Patriots have a shot at winning, more and more people will side with the Patriots. Choosing sides is not easy. For the Americans that are patriots, they're fighting for their lives and their properties and their ideals and their beliefs. You know, if someone picks a fight with you because they think you wear funny clothes, you might fight back because you got to defend the way you dress. You believe that you are the way you are and you have the right to be the way you are, and you're not harming anyone because you dress funny, or that you comb your hair funny, or that you shave your head, you look amazing bald. Those are all ideals that we have. And if someone wants to challenge me or attack my house and my children or my wife are home, they're going to have a fight on their hands because I'm going to protect them. They have support from countries even like the French, who may not be willing to throw in and give stuff to the Americans quite yet, but the French hate the British. So as this thing gets kicked off, the Americans definitely have people on their sideline cheering them on. They've got George Washington, who, though in the beginning might seem to be a little slow, he will prove to be the man that's able to hold the Continental Army together and build a Continental Army in the face of staggering defeat in some instances. George is able to hold them together. I'm not sure there's another man that could have done that. And remember, back in the 7 Years' War and the French and Indian War, George had been captured by the French and could have been taken prisoner or maybe even potentially killed. So how lucky were we as a country that we have that? Back to the French and the Spanish, it's not so much that the French and the Spanish love America as much as they dislike the British. And they also know that the French and the Spanish could get favorable trade from America. America does have some resources that are rare to the rest of the world, like our tobacco, for instance, or later our cotton. And the Spanish and French like the idea of maybe getting some sweet trade deals. And we're fighting at home. The home field advantage is huge. You know, I've talked before, the example I use, if I invited all of you over to my house for a paintball war, even though I'm old and slow and I don't run very fast, well, I really don't run at all, I'm going to have an advantage because I know where the hiding places are. I know where the patches of poison ivy are that I'm going to convince you to belly crawl your way through so that you're going to be miserable for weeks after visiting my house. The Americans have sort of the same advantage. And then up to 250,000 militia. Remember, militia aren't real soldiers. They're kind of like partially trained soldiers. Maybe we take math class off once a week and go out onto the football field and drill. We would be militia, not necessarily able to stand up one against one versus British soldiers, but certainly a large number. The British weaknesses, they're fighting for pay. If they die, they don't get paid. They lack support in Great Britain, so a lot of British people didn't like the idea, and they're overconfident. We might call that arrogant or cocky today. They just believe they're better, which sometimes pays off and sometimes goes against you. And it's sorry, Great Britain, they don't have any friends. No allies. Nobody wants to side with the British because they're rude and they've taken advantage of other countries for decades. And they're 3,000 miles from home, so when they need reinforcements or supplies or men or guns or ammunition, it's going to take a long time to get there. It's not like they can call the Amazon guy and have Prime Delivery show up with fresh guns and ammunition 1 or 2 days later. There is no 2-day delivery. It's going to take weeks for information and weeks for supplies to travel across the Atlantic Ocean to get to America to fight the colonies. And they're looking at about 54,000 troops, and we've already talked about how many, or at least some of those troops, weren't the cream of the crop. Some of them were criminals from England. Many of them were not the best of the best. They were just serving and fighting for pay, remember. So to prep for war on June 1775, G-Dub is made the commander-in-chief of the Continental Army. They're untrained, they're undisciplined, they're volunteers. You can only expect so much from people that are volunteers. You can't make them do horrible, harsh work if they're not getting anything for it. But many have the will to fight because they're fighting to protect their families and their homes. And at the beginning of the war, they're only asked to enlist for 1 year, which means either they thought this war was going to be over quickly or there would never be a war to start with. A 1-year enlistment isn't very long. If you think about today, if you sign up for military service, the average military service for an American enlisted person would be probably 4 years. And of that first year, you're going to spend most of it training for your ability to be able to fight in a war. So this isn't a very big commitment from these men. But being volunteers, it is a big commitment. Early on, only about 17,000 men volunteer for the Continental Army, and they don't have supplies, they don't have guns, they don't have ammunition. And the Continental Congress refuses to give them the money that they need for supplies and guns and ammunition because nobody in America wants to pay the taxes that would be required to support an army that's able to defend itself. So George Washington not only has to deal with untrained and undisciplined, but he also has to fight to get the money for the supplies that his men need. This is tough. When we look at the role of women, we've talked about this before. Women's job throughout almost all of history is to take care of their men, to cook and clean and raise the children. In this instance, oftentimes when men went off to fight, the women just followed them from camp to camp, doing those things. So when the men get home from a tough day of drilling out on the field with Friedrich von Steuben later on, or George Washington, or they've got a nice warm meal maybe at camp. Again, maybe it gives them more of a reason to fight when the wife and kids are there with them. We also see that there are a few women, like Deborah Sampson, who disguised herself as a man so that she could fight. That role has always existed, of women that wanted to be participants, that wanted to be part of the game, but aren't allowed to. Women were not allowed in George Washington's army. So Deborah Sampson would bind her chest tightly with bandages and wear loose, baggy shirts and clothing. The fact that she had no facial hair wasn't that big of a deal because a lot of the men in G-Dub's army were young men that couldn't grow facial hair anyway. The fact that she had women's long hair, well, most men either had long hair or wore a wig, so she could get away with it. But Deborah Sampson was definitely in the minority. She is the only woman from the American Revolution, and there were a few others that fought, that after the war was given a full pension, which means she was given retirement from the military. She actually got wounded twice. The first time Deborah Sampson was wounded, they took her to a field hospital unconscious, and before the doctor could get to her to check out her wounds, she figured out what was going on and she took off. She ran away. The second time, it was impossible for her to escape. She'd received a wound and her clothing were removed, and the doctors discovered that she was not a he. So Deborah Sampson was definitely in the minority. When we look at American women today as part of our military service, there are approximately, this is today in 2023, approximately 1.4 million people in service of the United States military. 17.2% of them are women. So less than 20% of the people that serve in the United States military today, and that's all branches of the military, are female. If we want to do a comparison with another modern day example, we know that there's war going on in Israel right now between the Israelis and Hamas. In the Israeli Defense Force, that's Israel's army, which, by the way, everyone is required at some point to serve in the Israeli military, that at least is capable. In 2021, the IDF Israeli Defense Force was 40% female. So in some countries, it's much more commonplace for women to be definitely involved. A couple more slides and then we'll be done for today. King George did hire those mercenaries from Germany called Hessians. Here's an image of what the Hessians might have looked like, and it was believed they were extra tall and extra mean and had bloody, pointy fangs with blood dripping off of them, which really is a falsity. It's just meant to make people believe they were tougher than they really were, but they had a reputation of being ferocious warriors. Their biggest weakness, just like British soldiers, was they were fighting for pay, and if you get dead, you don't get paid. So, if we just get kick-started into this in the Middle States in July of 1776, the leader of the British is a man named Howe, General Howe. He lands in New York and he brings with him a large army and 9,000 Hessian mercenaries. After months of fighting, as you saw in the video, George Washington is chased off, and the spirits for the Patriots are extremely low. They're horrified at the idea that they're not going to be able to compete for victory against this powerful British army. So George Washington is going to have to do something. And he goes back to his old friend Thomas Paine. Remember the guy that wrote the pamphlet Common Sense, which sold 100,000 copies in 3 months? Thomas Paine this time writes another pamphlet called The Crisis, calling for patriot help. And in The Crisis, he quotes, "These are the times that try men's souls. The summer soldier and the sunshine patriot will in this crisis shrink from the service of their country. But he that stands it now deserves the love and thanks of man and woman." All right, if we break this down, these are the times that try men's souls. What does that mean? Pause. Pause. It means these are the times that test whether or not we're strong enough to stand up to our own will, to our enemies, to our opponents. What is a summer soldier? Well, it's kind of what it sounds like, a man who's only willing to fight in the summer. Let's face it, fighting when the weather's cold and you're freezing doesn't sound very appealing to very many people. And they're not wearing fancy Thinsulate gloves and overalls and boots. A sunshine patriot, that's a little bit misleading. If you think about that, you might guess that they're only willing to fight during the sunshine or during the daytime. In reality, this one's a little different. Sunshine patriot really represents the kind of person that only fights when the fighting is good. In this crisis, shrink from the service of their country. What do you think shrink from the service of their country means? Pause. Pause a little longer while you think about it. Maybe stop the video while somebody tries to answer this question. Pause. Shrink from the service of your country means you disappear. If you're going to lose, I think I'll just go home where it's safe and warm and maybe even pay those British taxes and pretend I was never part of this. It's the safe thing to do. But he that stands it now, those of us that stick around and fight alongside George Washington, deserve the love and thanks of man and woman. Everyone's going to appreciate us. So when Thomas Paine writes The Crisis, people come to George Washington's army. People are ready to fight. It increases the number of people that George can get alongside him, even though he still has a huge uphill battle fighting against superior forces and stronger men. George is going to have to learn to use tactics to defeat his enemy. We see this quote, Colonel Rahl, "Let them come, we will go at them with the bayonet." A bayonet is a knife on the end of a gun. We've heard of that before. But Colonel Rahl there also demonstrates the British arrogance, that idea that the British are just that much better than everyone else. So if we take a look back at today's expectations, we reviewed with that quick video in the beginning. We started the revolution. You should have got some fill-in notes done today. And now that you have a little bit of time at the end of class, I really would like you working on your study guide. We had issues with that in chapter 5 and 6 with people not completing it. So go in and see what you can fill out from the 5 or 6 slides that we did today. And if you get finished with all of those things, find something else to work on, please. You can read a book or work on IXL, but please use your time wisely. Thank you guys for cooperating. I appreciate you, and I will see you soon.